Yeah, this might need to be multiple videos. Welcome back to this comprehensive retrospective of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. We're talking about classes today, Chapter 3. This is probably the most significant chunk of rules text in the game outside of combat and spell chapters, and it's 75 pages long, so we've got a lot to cover. To start us out, I want to cover two things: the design pattern of a class in the TTRPG, and more specifically in 5th edition, as well as start looking at the contents of the class chapter. To the first subject, we can frame the question a few ways. What's a class? What does it do? What's its purpose? Character class is part of the two-part structure of a playable character, the other part being their race. Like race, it's about creating differentiation between player characters and giving definition to their abilities. Your class in an RPG is a packet of rules that governs how you interact with the rest of the system. One way or another, it defines what is effectively your interface with the game. Think of it like a game controller. Each button is some sort of interaction specific to your class. No two classes have the same exact set of abilities, but there is overlap, and some classes are more similar to one another than to others. In the 5th edition Player's Handbook, there are 12 classes: Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. 3 of these guys can trace their origin all the way back to basic D&D. The Fighter, the fighting man back then, the Cleric, and the Wizard, who was originally called simply Magic User. The Rogue, who was originally the Thief, followed them quickly after, and supplements introduced most of the other classes over the course of D&D's run through 1st and 2nd edition, where they appeared varyingly as proto-prestige classes or as packets of alternate class features called kits. 3rd edition is where the current roster of classes largely crystallized. You see how this keeps happening? And the only new addition to the roster since then that survived into 5th edition is the Warlock. In 5th edition, your class defines a lot about your character. It's through leveling up in one or more classes that you gain features, which confer abilities beyond just rolling a d20 to try and do something that a normal person could attempt. Classes grant weapon and armor proficiency, skill proficiency, access to magic, extra attacks, improved defense against various types of danger, recovery options, novel uses for character skills, and more. Each class also has a specific fantasy archetype that it's designed to embody, and in theory, its features should provide options that facilitate a play style that helps the player feel like that archetype as they adventure. On top of that, each class's unique flavor should, although this will vary by player and DM, impact how the game world reacts to them and how they, in turn, will engage with the game world. I'll be doing individual videos for each class in the Player's Handbook here and assessing how well they meet this criteria, as well as digging into the mechanical balance of their design. I won't be touching the Artificer for now. They may get their own thing later on, but for now, we're focused on the Player's Handbook. Now, on to Chapter 3 itself. There's a short preamble to introduce the concept of classes and the content of this chapter, as well as a table that provides a nice side-by-side comparison of each class, along with some key data points like hit dice, proficiencies, and saving throws. This introductory section paints a flavorful picture of the concept of classes, and for players' first exposure to the mechanic, it's not a bad one. However, this chapter is filled with mechanics, only a few of which have been touched upon, and very briefly in the preceding chapters. So, on a front-to-back read-through, a lot of this is going over a new player's head. This fact alone is enough of a case to move all the game rules from Part 2, and maybe even chapters from Part 3, up to the front of the book, ahead of all the character creation stuff, which is what they did for the 2024 Player's Handbook. On the other hand, having all the character creation stuff up front does make it easier to crack the book open and quickly orient yourself to begin creating a new character, which is a different sort of usefulness you'd lose from reordering. And arguably, it's the reason this ordering has been the go-to for Player's Handbooks dating back to basic D&D. It's a question of priority, I suppose. Personally, I prefer the 2014 ordering to the new 2024, but I do think 2014 probably should have been the publication to publish the rules before character creation. But hindsight is 2010. Anyways, I want to talk about this table. Here, we've got a list of all 12 classes, along with a brief and flavorful description for each, and a listing of their hit die, primary ability score, saving throw proficiencies, and weapon and armor proficiencies. This is a really good opportunity to dig into class balance a bit before we get really granular with each individual class, but we'll circle back to this in a conclusion video once that's all done. The big thing that I want to talk about first, though, is saving throws. Saving throws are one of 3 types of d20 roll in this game, besides attacks and ability checks. You roll a saving throw to avoid or resist something. While attacks are aggressive and checks are proactive, saves are defensive. Saves are tied to the 6 ability scores, and each effect that calls for a saving throw specifies which ability modifier you add to your save. You roll above the DC, and you either avoid or otherwise mitigate the effect threatening you. Roll below it, and you take the full brunt of the danger posed. This can be from magic, environmental hazards, special abilities, whatever. Every class gets 2 saving throw proficiencies from the 6 available, and their saving throws are always a pairing of a common save, like dexterity, constitution, or wisdom, with an uncommon save, like strength, intelligence, or charisma. With a proficiency, you add your proficiency bonus to saves of that type. Now, these proficiencies are assigned by flavor at a glance. Marshals almost always receive a combination of strength and dexterity or constitution, with the exception of the rogue, who has dexterity and intelligence, while casters have their primary casting stat paired with another mental stat. The exception to this is the bard, who has dexterity and charisma, and the sorcerer, who has constitution and charisma. Now, it may sound like we're done here, but the saving throw situation in the classes has been observed as a very big problem in the larger context of 5e's rule system. There's a lot more to talk about here, but for context, we need to back up a bit. In previous editions, saves were handled a few different ways. In first edition, saves were specific to certain types of effects, like petrification, magic spells, poison, dragon breath, instant death, and each class had static save progression against these effects. 5th edition, however, draws more from 3rd edition, where saving throws were relegated to 3 different types: fortitude, reflex, and will, and these roughly correspond to constitution, dexterity, and wisdom in 5th edition. That said, 3rd edition saves also advanced on a static track like in 1st edition, based on your class and your level. Each class had strong and weak saves which grew at different rates, but a cleric's strong saves grew at the same pace as a fighter's strong save, and same for their weak saves. 5th edition, however, does not have its saving throws grow at fixed rates. They're tied directly to your proficiency bonus if you're proficient, which grows by +1 every 5 levels from +2 to +6, and to your ability scores, which can grow by +1 in 1 score every time you get an ability score increase, up to +5. I hope you're seeing the issue here. Saving throws in 5th edition do not grow without dedicating resources to them, so the only saves that a class is guaranteed to develop over time are their proficient saves, and whichever ones they deem worth spending an ASI on. And frankly, spending an ASI on +1 to a save when you could get a feat instead is a really hard sell to a lot of players. So 9 times out of 10, 4 of a character's saving throws do not change at all from level 1 to level 20, and that sucks. It sucks because while a character's saves don't grow in 5th edition, the DC for saving throws demanded by spells and monster abilities do grow as the threat increases. A CR6 mage has a spell save DC of 14, a CR12 archmage has a DC 17, and a CR21 lich has DC 20. A CR24 ancient red dragon's fire breath is a DC 24 dexterity save. That is literally impossible to succeed on if you don't have at least a +4 in dexterity, and even then, you need a natural 20, and that's really unlikely for a lot of classes, as is. Only 1 in 4 classes has dex as a proficient save. If non-proficient saves got even half of your proficiency bonus added to them, a level 17 character could much more feasibly reach a +4 or +5 for a 5 to 10% chance to at least attempt to succeed on a DC 24. But as is, 5e saves basically stay where they are unless they're your proficient saves. So that's one problem. The other issue is a disparity in the need for specific saves versus the proficiencies given to each class, which stems in part from the way the saving throw system transitioned from 3rd to 5th edition. You remember how 3rd edition had fortitude, reflex, and will saves? Those aren't in 5e. They do roughly map to constitution, dexterity, and wisdom, but if you'll recall, 5th edition also has saves for strength, intelligence, and charisma. 5th edition dispensed with those additional game terms and tied saves directly to the ability scores, so each score has a corresponding saving throw bonus where one could be proficient. Obviously, all of the 3rd edition abilities that were keyed to require fortitude, reflex, and will saves couldn't stay that way, so they had to be rewritten to work with the new save system. And since 5th edition has 6 saves instead of just 3, as part of that transition, all updated spells and abilities had to be reassigned to try and spread them across 6 saving throws. This process did not go very well. Fortitude was split between strength and constitution, while will got split between all 3 mental ability scores. Reflex got to basically go straight to dexterity. The end result of this, however, is an extremely lopsided distribution of saves required by various spells and abilities. The problem with this transition, weirdly, is that the design team had a very reasonable desire to try and impose a sense of consistency and flavor to what each saving throw resisted. They spell it out in the DMG. Strength is the save to resist being moved or restrained against your will, while constitution is for enduring against corrosion, poison, fatigue, and other wear and tear effects. Wisdom is the go-to for resisting most magical or supernatural effects, with intelligence being specifically about resisting psychic manipulation, sometimes illusions, and also having your brain eaten. I'm not sure why that's not con. Also, charisma is about force of will, resisting supernatural restraint, compulsion, or teleportation of some kind. Stuff like banishment, zone of truth, the ghost's possession ability, or the teleportation clause of force page. If you can see a through line between all of those, more power to you. And dexterity, I mean, its predecessor was pretty self-explanatory. Dex saves are about avoiding damage via quick reflexes, traps, dragon breath, fireball, that kind of thing. All of this to say, the design team approached this transition with what looks like a very solid methodical plan, but the end result of this is an extremely lopsided distribution, and we've seen that distribution become more and more so with each new publication. To start out, dex and con saves are the most common saving throws in the game. 69 published spells to date require dex saves, and 60 spells require con, and across just the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters, there are 117 dexterity saves and 197 constitution saves, but they're also among the least common starting save proficiencies, going only to bards, rogues, and rangers, or barbarians, fighters, and sorcerers, respectively. Meanwhile, there are 56 spells requiring wisdom saves and 96 abilities across the Monster Manual and Volos, but half of the playable classes start with wisdom save proficiency: cleric, druid, paladin, warlock, and wizard. Barbarians, fighters, monks, and rangers get strength saves, of which 20 published spells and 84 abilities in the Monster Manual and Volos force strength saves. Druids and wizards have what is effectively a dead saving throw proficiency in intelligence: 12 spells and 11 abilities in the Monster Manual and Volos. Bards, clerics, paladins, sorcerers, and warlocks all get charisma saves, which is just as bad. There are 17 spells and 16 abilities across the Monster Manual and Volos that require these. As exceptions to this, remember that the rogues get wisdom proficiency at level 15, and monks get proficiency in all saves at level 14. All of this is to say, some classes have markedly worse defenses than others just by virtue of having proficiency in a rare saving throw. In an environment with completely random combat encounters, a wizard or druid is going to fail more saving throws more often than a barbarian or a fighter. And remember, barbarians get near blanket advantage on dex saves at level 2 as well. Having said that, are the consequences of a failed save all equal? No, absolutely not. Failing a strength save on average is not nearly as consequential as failing a wisdom or intelligence save. Being pushed backwards or knocked prone is nowhere near as bad as being dominated or having your brain eaten, or being internally imprisoned in bowels of the earth, although being restrained can quickly spiral into death, so there is that small counterpoint. Still, there is a significant imbalance to the current saving throw environment, and I would argue it's a major failing of 5th edition's class balance. You could try to make a case here that asymmetric balance is its own kind of balance, and in some games I'd agree, but 5th edition being as focused on player empowerment as it is a tip-off that this is not one of those games. Is there a fix here for the enterprising dungeon master? I can think of several. There's always the brute force method of simply correcting this imbalance and reassigning some of the saving throws in the spells chapter alongside monster abilities to even out this discrepancy. This would probably require breaking the internal logic the design team tried to impose on saves during the transition to 5th edition to begin with, but since that logic isn't really serving us, it's a small loss. This would, however, require a lot of work, and frankly, since WotC didn't do it for the new core rulebook, I don't know why anyone else would bother. There are easier fixes. One of them being you could revert back to fortitude, reflex, or will saves, which might feel like a step backwards, but honestly, it would do a lot to solve the problems with 5e saves. Decisions would have to be made regarding who gets what saving throw proficiency and how those proficiencies would be calculated, but there is precedent in previous editions to refer back to, and frankly, following those examples would solve some other problems around saves in 5e that we'll talk about later. This would have the benefit of being easy to adjudicate in the moment once the proficiency question has been handled, however. Oh, it's an intelligence save? Okay, roll using will. Strength save? Use fortitude. I might make a how-to video for this sort of patch at some point. I do like this idea. Swinging in a different direction, you could allow classes to pick 2 saving throw proficiencies from a pool of 3 or 4 based on their class, the character creation, maybe even all 6 for the monk. This approach would be a more player-centric solution with way less work required to get off the ground. Like the ASI assignments, players would be free to decide from the get-go what defenses they want to prioritize, which is a huge user experience win in terms of player empowerment and customization. There is an argument that this is just offloading 5e saving throw problems to players to solve, which, sure. And there's also the possible danger that a player is going to pick a terrible combo like intelligence and charisma. This is what we used to call a trap option back in 3rd edition. Maybe we could put some guardrails on by pre-selecting the strong saves like dex, con, and whiz, and letting players pick their weak save like strength, intelligence, or charisma, although that might not be enough freedom, and it probably isn't worth allowing the choice anyways, because I would always pick strength in that situation, but it's an option. Finally, I've been toying with an idea that I later saw a channel called Encounter Mastering Dungeons, which is run by a Mr. Malcolm the Brewmaster, independently iterate on with a solution that he calls unbounded proficiency. The idea is pretty simple. Just make all saves scale by tying proficiency to them. Malcolm's version of this attaches your proficiency bonus to all saves and AC values in the game, and optionally to attack and spell damage, since this homebrew is more largely aimed at tackling issues with 5e's overall mathematical structure. In his fix, you instead get expertise for the 2 saves specified at character creation, which doubles your proficiency bonus for those 2 saves. If you want a more restrained version of this, my approach would have been to lift from the bard's jack of all trades grades feature. All creatures get at least half of their proficiency bonus added to their saving throws and get their normal saves as normal. If you want to stick closer to the rules, you can round down. If you want your save to scale a little faster, you can round up. There is definitely more to be said about saving throws, but we'll save that for the video on Chapter 7. I've dwelled too long on saves, and we've got a lot more to cover on this table. So, moving on. The hit die column is cool. Yeah, let's take a look at that for a moment. Yeah, there's not much here, to be honest. D8 hit dice are the baseline, with the squishiest casters, wizards, and sorcerers running on D6s, the heavy marshals, fighter, paladin, ranger running on D10s, and barbarians being the only D12 class in the game, as though they needed any more help. Ugh. Unlike the saving throw situation, the hit dice spread is really only objectionable if you want your arcane casters a little less squishy, and if that's you, quit being greedy. Wizards used to run on D4, and they liked it that way. Or if you made monks and know how badly they need some support to do their job, which, yeah, no, we'll talk about monks. The primary ability column. Nice guide for new players to know where their ASI should be directed. This column does neglect to mention how ubiquitously important Dex and Con are to all characters, and come to think of it, Step-by-Step Character Chapter didn't really highlight this fact either. It does, however, at least point out to us from the jump who our multi-ability dependent classes are. The Monk, Paladin, and Ranger. Oh, just you wait, Monk. We'll get to you. Don't worry. You too, Ranger. But hey, Paladin? Never change. Finally, there's weapon and armor proficiency. Now, the weapon system in 5th edition is not a particularly robust one. Because of its simplicity, there are a handful of weapons that are very quickly established as the meta picks for the folks who can wield them. Great swords and great axes are the two options if you want either a D12 or 2D6, since they have the same maximum damage output, but 2D6 is more consistent and a little less spiky. Otherwise, you take a D10 polearm, which synergizes with Great Weapon Master and the polearm master feat. Dual-wielding hand crossbows go with sharpshooter and crossbow expert, and everything else is kind of mid, although you can pair a one-handed weapon with shields. D4 weapons are pointless trash, and you basically wear the best armor you can get a hold of for your dex score, with some consideration made around whether your party enjoys a good stealth segment or not. However, the 2024 Player's Handbook did bring weapon masteries to the table, and while the optimization consequences for this new system hasn't been well established, we're certainly due for a slightly more diverse weapon ecosystem with this new edition. And that about covers the table, but there is one more major component of the class system to cover before we get to the nitty-gritty stuff, and it's not in the table. Honestly, it kind of should be. Either way, 5th edition brings us the subclass mechanic to its class system, which is a very streamlined and cleaned up take on previous edition systems like prestige classes, hybrid classes, archetypes. Look, 3rd edition was really, really messy, okay? It was very big at the time, but it was very piecemeal by the end of its run. And a big part of 5e's success, I think, hinges on taking the lessons of 3rd edition and cleaning them up as much as humanly possible. One big aspect of 3rd edition that people really got into, which arguably helped sell the plethora of splat books that came out for 3rd edition, was character building. To be very, very general about this, 3rd edition presented a very complex environment of mix and match character options that you could dig through in search of the right combination of options to do something cool or ridiculous. Feats were part of that, but the other part of it were distinct alterations to a character's class. Multiclassing obviously was an option, but there were also prestige classes, special classes with shortened progression tracks and specialized abilities that you had to qualify for with specific combinations of levels and various other classes, minimum skill ranks. Sometimes you had to be a certain race. You also had hybrid classes eventually come out, which sort of blended the power of two base classes. And then there were archetypes, which let you swap out certain features in your base class for other features without necessarily altering the core chassis. And all of these options were, theoretically at least, viable to try running on the same character. It was so messy. And what 5e did with subclasses was look at all of that and say, okay, cool, there's clearly something appealing here. Let's make it make sense. And what we have now is a really clean, elegant framework. Every class, at some point in the first 3 levels, picks a subclass. That subclass is a specialization, and every few levels after that, characters get a new feature from their subclass, which is earmarked as a subclass feature in their class progression table. These subclasses sort of thread the needle between prestige classes and archetypes. The base class acts as a kind of chassis that lets every one of that class benefit from some core impactful features, but subclasses are where the specificity, the seasoning, the specialization comes from. An assassin rogue is a very different fellow from the arcane trickster, and a wildfire druid is a very different guy from the spore druid. Every subclass has 3 or 4 levels worth of features that they impart, and those features get to be unique and flavorful and interesting, hopefully. And you don't have to do the 20-year Gandalf lore hunt to learn all of the hundreds of character options, interactions with one another, just to get something functional. The subclass is designed, again, hopefully, from the outset to be a complete package of features that enables you to play out the fantasy they embody. Subclasses are a big deal for 5th edition. It's really really important to remember this after 10 years have passed, because it did a lot to clean up the design space of D&D and systematize character building in a way that was much more streamlined and approachable than it was before. Is it a perfect system? No, of course not. You are at the mercy of the design team's vision for a subclass concept and beholden to the feature package that they are effectively pre-selecting for you from all conceivable features that could be envisioned, and in previous editions could have been brought together at the player's volition. So if the designers put together an overall weak or ineffective package of features and calls it a subclass, there's not much recourse outside of straight up homebrewing fixes, which I am absolutely for the record, and that subclass isn't going to see much play. Now, the 2014 Player's Handbook definitely has its share of these. The Berserker Barbarian, the Assassin Rogue, sadly, the Beastmaster Ranger, holy cow, that one is bad, and the Four Elements Monk. I swear we will talk in depth about the 2014 Monk in its own video, are at the foremost of my mind. I'm sure that there are others that people could point to as problematically put together as well, but it is still a much less complicated design system than what came before it, and it does allow all characters to participate in some prestige class style concepts to one degree or another. That was a big shift when 5th edition came out, and it's not one that we should take for granted, as it continues to be refined and iterated on in the 2024 handbook. It's just worth mentioning that before we wrap this video up. As we do, I just want to thank everyone for their time and attention today, and hey, if you're new, why not like and subscribe? You made it this far, and there's plenty more to come. I am just getting started. We've covered the first page of the class chapter, and I spent most of it railing against saving throws. We've been productive, arguably. I think we can finally get to the classes themselves. Next video, we're going to start with the Barbarian. I'll see you there.